This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, number 114, Tolkien, Part 1. I'm Hal Hammonds, and I am a Citizen of Heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for checking in this week. J.R.R. Tolkien has to be considered one of the most influential authors of the 20th century, especially by Christians. His stories speak directly to great spiritual and moral truths for those inclined to listen. This week I am sharing my conversation with two Christians who know Tolkien far better than I. Josh Everett is a professor of English literature at Central Texas College in Killeen. Edwin Crozier is an evangelist with the Livingston Church of Christ in Lutz, Florida, and the co-host of the popular Text Talk podcast. Let's start with what I've been preaching. Evil is real and on the move. Pretty much everyone agrees on that point, but we do not universally agree with regard to where to draw the boundary line. From a Christian perspective, evil should be simple, the side opposed to God. In reality, though, living in the world can easily turn that perspective on its head. How do we find the courage to face down the orcs and Uruk-hai of this world, and how do we identify the Saurons who are hiding in plain sight? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Evil, I think, as Christians, we know it is real, right? Just as sin is real. But when it comes to people, I think we need to be careful. I don't think we need to argue that people are inherently evil or inherently good, right? That maybe this would be a good time for a discussion of free will. First of all, we know that there is this battle going on all around us as Christians that involves evil. If you look at Ephesians 6, verse 12, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So the real evil is spiritual in the spiritual realm, and those evil powers are trying to influence people on the earth. And so it's up to us to choose. In Joshua 24, when he says, choose this day whom you shall serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So if we don't have a choice, going back to the predestination argument, then Joshua wouldn't be asking them to make that choice. And so evil is real, but we don't have to give into it. We don't have to give into the temptation to sin.
One of the things, especially in the context of Lord of the Rings and the worlds of Tolkien, and maybe even getting into the worlds of Lewis, is recognizing that existence of evil is not just the realm of the misunderstood. The realm of those who, if we knew their backstory, we'd understand why they're acting that way. And so that means that everything is just okay. I really appreciate Josh bringing up the idea of the spiritual realm behind what we're experiencing. And one of the things that I think is often missed in reading the fantasy of Tolkien is, for instance, Gandalf, Sauron, they're not humans. They're actually much more like angelic beings, which is why Gandalf is able to essentially be killed, but then he comes back as Gandalf the White, and folks are very confused by that because that just doesn't make sense. And if Gandalf was just a human, it wouldn't make sense. It's not just, fantasy, so rules don't matter. It's the fact that Gandalf is actually this being who is much more angelic than human in that fantasy realm, just like Saruman is. So the spiritual realm behind what's going on, I think Tolkien was very well aware of that. And when Gandalf says things to Frodo like, you got that ring, and it's shocking that you got the ring. I don't remember the exact lines, but he says there's something very comforting about that there's something going on in the world that says that the evil is being fought by the good. And so it's very comforting. So again, all that spiritual realm behind that, which ties in, and I want to jump off of what Josh pointed out, and that is in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. When we take a look at what's going on in the human earthly sphere, the enemy is the devil, and those spiritual beings and the cosmic powers in the heavenly places. That's the enemy. That's who we're really fighting against, which of course is why we need God, because we can't beat that. When we're talking to other folks, though, in the world, when we're talking to other folks who are around us, we're looking at people who have been captured by the enemy to do his will. They have become complicit. our goal is not to fight against them. Our goal is to help them escape from the control that sin and Satan has taken over in their lives. And of course, the only way to escape that is through Jesus, who is not simply an angelic being. He is God. He is the creator. Which, of course, all this now leads to, how can we tell the difference as we're walking through this life regarding those who really are in the service of the one who's evil, even though they may be captured and captive and we're trying to help them escape. One of the passages that jumps to my mind is in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7. Beware of false prophets, verse 15, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you'll recognize them by their fruits. We're supposed to be looking at what their lives and their teaching produces, but I think it's even a little bit more than that. It's only been recently, and I don't know why it's only been recently, but rather than reading these as separate vignettes, I walk right in now to the next vignette that Jesus has. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. There in that picture of judgment, these folks are actually talking about the fruit they produce. They're saying, look, doesn't our fruit demonstrate that we were with you? Because look at this fruit of these amazing works, these miraculous works, these really spiritual works. And Jesus says, no, that's not the fruit I'm looking for. This is not the fruit you're looking for. I know that's a different world. Sorry. He's looking for the fruit of doing what he said. If somebody is teaching what Jesus taught and doing what Jesus taught, that's the side I need to be on. If someone's teaching something else, that's it. It doesn't matter how good they look.
It's interesting the way you bring that up in Matthew chapter 7. And I was thinking again of Tolkien and the contrast between beings that seem almost inherently evil, like orcs, these monsters that we see, versus the Sarumans of the world, the false prophets, the wolves in sheep's clothing, who give the appearance of doing the right thing, who give the appearance of standing for what's right, but in truth have almost even more voluntarily given themselves over to evil. I'm not suggesting that evil is ever forced upon us, but when you, from a spiritual perspective, trying to visualize the right thing to do and choosing evil in that place, I'm going to do evil that good may come, like Paul talks about in Romans chapter 3. That kind of deliberate choice against righteousness, if anything, is even more despicable and more indicative of spiritual failure than these people who, one might argue, just simply didn't know any better. Seeing this conflict, and it's not just Tolkien, it's not just the Bible, it's all these good versus evil stories that we see. There seems to almost always be this choice that you have, this free will. We are caught up in these bad things, but we can get out of this. Usually we need help to get out of it, but we can choose right, no matter how easy it is to choose wrong or how many people choose wrong around us. We can do the right thing.
When you look at the Silmarillion by Tolkien, there's a sort of the mythology structure that lays out the background of what's happening with Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. But even the seemingly most evil characters in Lord of the Rings, Sauron is someone that Tolkien envisioned as having a choice. Sauron is a servant of Melkor, who is supposed to be this sort of divine being, who almost seems to be like a sort of a representation of Satan, who chooses to go against a character named Iluvatar and chooses to go to war with him and to become corrupt by his desire for power. Then later you have Sauron, who's a servant of Melkor, Morgoth, who's choosing to do the exact same thing. But I think every character in Lord of the Rings is susceptible to that same kind of choice. And when we see the ring, which I think is a representation of absolute power, but all of the characters are susceptible to that temptation to abuse their power. It kind of reminds me of in Matthew chapter 20, when the disciples are arguing amongst themselves about who's going to be the most powerful in heaven, who's going to be at the right hand of God and who's going to be at the left hand, and what's going to be the hierarchy. and they're arguing about power. And Jesus is like, this is not what this is about. It's not about power. It's not about hierarchy. It's about service, right? Service to your fellow man, loving your neighbor as yourself, and washing the feet of your fellow man. It's about putting yourself last. But everyone is susceptible to that temptation of power, and we know absolute power corrupts absolutely. As we see, Gandalf at one point being tempted, Frodo offers him the ring, and he's like, no, you don't understand, through me what wickedness it could produce. And we see Boromir trying to steal the ring. He's corrupted by that power. We see people kind of going to the dark side, choosing to give into that temptation. But then we also see the king of the Rohirrim, who has been possessed by Saruman.
Theoden.
Yeah, Theoden. Thank you very much. And he's being controlled and sort of manipulated by Saruman. And yet Gandalf kind of shows up, and it almost seems like an exorcism of a demon or something, and he frees him from that power. And then Theoden is able to recover and go on to be a good character. So we see people kind of on all sides, either giving into darkness and choosing to become evil, or reversing and coming out of it. When Helm's Deep is surrounded by thousands upon thousands of orcs and goblins, and it seems as if the people are outnumbered and there's no hope. At the last moment, we see Gandalf show up and that light coming from his staff, and he has this army with him to sort of save the day. And there's never a time when Satan can outnumber us and can force us to sin and force us to give into the darkness. Jesus is that hero on the white horse that has the power to defeat any enemy that we may come up against. As long as we have faith and we lean upon Christ, we can destroy all enemies of darkness that are around us.
I think one of the things that is interesting, I know when you've asked the question, you've brought up the orcs and the Uruk-hai, the obvious evil, wicked people. They look evil, they are evil, they were created to be evil. The bigger struggle is when, for instance, Frodo has left the Shire. He's supposed to be meeting Gandalf. Gandalf isn't showing up, and there's this fellow that's watching him and then kind of corners him in one of the rooms. And they're trying to figure out, should we trust this fella? And he ends up being Aragorn, who is the king, and Strider. And one of the comments, and I will admit, I'm not a purist. I loved the movies of Lord of the Rings, not so much The Hobbit. I love the movies of Lord of the Rings. I love the books. I know they're a little bit different. And sometimes I forget which came from where. So if I cross over, just really sorry about that. But I think this is a statement that's made in both the books and the movie, as Frodo was describing his trust of Aragorn. He said, I would think that the enemies would look fairer but feel fouler. And it's one of those things that, we get it. Orcs and Uruk-hai, those guys are obviously bad. Let's not get involved with them. But there's these other levels. Well, what about Grima Wormtongue? What about Theoden? What about Denethor? What about Boromir and Faramir? What about Aragorn? How do we know? And these are the folks that are kind of locked in the battle exactly where we are locked in the battle. To whom are folks giving their allegiance? It's not always obvious. And that's where having to know the word is so utterly important. Jesus talks about his sheep, and he says, my sheep know my voice. When we get out of that realm of fantasy and we get into real world where we are, the real key is I have got to know the voice of the shepherd, because if I don't know the voice of the shepherd, I'm going to hear other voices and be distracted. And all these other methods of trying to judge are going to lead me astray. What I need to know is the voice of my shepherd. And so, for instance, bringing up Theoden, the movie did make it seem a whole lot more like an exorcism than in my take the book did, but there was still a little bit of that. But what was going on? Grima Wormtongue. Theoden had given himself over to the advice and counsel of the wrong voice. Gandalf comes in and is able to bring him back to the right voice. On the other hand, you've got Denethor, and as much as Gandalf tries to help him come back to the right voice, he's been listening to the voice through the Palantir. He's been dabbling in the arts of the enemy, and it's taken over.
There is absolute wrong in the world. If we don't sign on with that basic premise, we're going to wind up just doing what feels right in the moment. We'll create our own idea of good and evil, because everybody believes in good and evil. They just may not believe in universal good and evil. They might not believe that God is the source of these definitions, but everybody believes in good guys and bad guys. That's why these stories are so resonant with us. That's why everybody gets into superhero stories or John Wayne movies or whatever. There is bad in the world. And if we can accept that God gets to define that, And then, as Edwin said, if we go back to the word and look at how he defines it, who is truly good, who is truly evil, then we set ourselves up for some success with regard to these things. There's always going to be that struggle, but we can find our way if we believe in God's message, if we believe in the map.
I think today, there's a lot of people that would argue that the only evil is like institutional, right? The government or certain groups that have power, that the systems are evil, but the individuals are just victims of this system. And so if we can just fix the systems, and then everything will just be wonderful. And I think in many ways, we're sort of shunning this idea of individual accountability. Each and every individual in society has the potential for evil, even in a perfect system, in a perfect world. Just being members of a church that's scriptural doesn't make us a good person or make us a good Christian. I mean, that is important, but it also is important that we make good decisions as individuals. And so, again, going back to Lord of the Rings or even the Narnia stories, I mean, every character is susceptible to sin, right, or to evil. We mentioned several examples, but going back to Saruman, Saruman kind of has this status. These are the Order of the White Wizards, which is a higher level than what Gandalf the Grey is. Well, we know that he turned to the dark side. He gives in to the temptation and the fear of the power that Sauron wields, and he decides it's not even possible to withstand that power. No one can escape this power, he says to Gandalf, and so we need to join him. That's our only means of survival. I think Saruman, maybe kind of represents the idea of the powers that be becoming corrupt, and it kind of reminds me of the times of Jesus when the high-ranking people of Judaism had become corrupt. They were more concerned about politics and power and reputation than they were about truth. And Jesus keeps saying over and over again that the kingdom is not about power, it's not about money, it's not about worldly reputation, it's not about social status, but it's about service, and it's about love, and it's about purifying yourself. Sometimes the people around us that seem to be righteous, or seem to be somebody of high status, like Saruman, they are not, immune to evil, and sometimes they have chosen to do things that are wrong. And you referenced that idea of the false teachers and the wolves in sheep's clothing, like what's talked about in Matthew chapter 7. It could be in our own congregation.
The people we come in contact with are not, again, themselves naturally and inherently the enemy. They become captured by the enemy to do his will. But I don't want to then turn around and make the mistake of then everyone around me is just kind of neutral and I have no discernment I need to make. I remember in Psalm 28, as I've been studying the Psalms over the past year, as David is crying out to the Lord in Psalm 28 and verse 3, do not drag me off with the wicked, with the workers of evil. We can become people who are workers of evil. And the fact that we have been taken captive by the enemy and become complicit with him doesn't just give us an out. Again, we're not just misunderstood. And I know that's becoming a very common thing, like the Maleficent movies, that we found out that Maleficent wasn't actually evil. She was really just misunderstood and abused until she got into this place. And we really can become workers of evil who seek peace with their neighbors while evil is in their hearts. Give to them according to their work and according to the evil of their deeds. Give to them according to the work of their hands. Render them their due reward. Now, the interesting thing is, at that point, I'm thinking about Hitler. And as Lord of the Rings is being written, while World War I was in his past, World War II was in his present. And what was going on in Germany, you've got Hitler and the Nazis and all of that stuff happening in the background behind this story. Yeah, Hitler's evil. That's super obvious. And so almost anyone today, if we ask, well, what do you think about Hitler? I don't want to say everyone, because I'm sure there are folks that are saying, no, he really wasn't all that bad. He was misunderstood. I don't know. But most of us would say, yeah, now that's evil. That is truly evil. And so we'll think about him. But in verse 5 of Psalm 28, David goes on to define what actually makes us evil. Because they do not regard the works of the Lord or the work of his hands, he will tear them down and build them up no more. Because they do not regard the work of the Lord and the work of his hands. In other words, they're focused more on the work of their own hands than the work of his hands. Now, here's the crazy, shocking thing about that. Who does that end up being? Well, in Acts chapter 7, it ends up being those people who put more emphasis on the temple made by human hands than on God and his holy universe, which were made by God's hands. And so When we're looking for those who are listening to the shepherd, it is going to be all about putting the emphasis on the work of God's hands, not on the work of my hands. And the work of my hands may not, as far as mankind be concerned, be considered super evil. I'm not Hitler. And I can't imagine getting to the point of acting like Hitler. But that doesn't make me less of a sinner if what I'm doing is focusing on the work of my own hands instead of the work of God's hands.
I was just thinking about that moment right at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring where Frodo separates from the group. And I'm thinking to myself, what an idiotic thing to do. You're a little bitty hobbit and you have no strength and you have no resources really to speak of. You're just committed to this cause and you're going to separate yourself from the people with the weapons and the people with abilities and the experience and all of that. And instead, you're going to travel around with other hobbits. They have no ability, they have no experience, but what they have is an unrelenting, unquestioning devotion to Frodo and to Frodo's cause. Their character is absolutely unimpeachable. And I think one of the lessons that I take away from this is that it's better to be surrounded by people of character, people who are committed to a cause, rather than people who are equipped to find success because of who they are and what they have. That's a choice that we find ourselves making as Christians, I think. If our sufficiency is from Jesus anyway, then surely it's much more important to find allies, to find support of a moral nature, of a spiritual nature, rather than surrounding ourselves with accomplished ones, confident ones, experienced ones. Because as we've seen earlier, those people oftentimes let us down. Those people oftentimes become part of the problem instead of part of the solution, because it's so easy to trust in ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that scene when Frodo decides to go off on his own, I think it was right after Boromir tried to steal the ring.
Right.
He realizes that nobody in my group can necessarily be trusted, right? That all of us are susceptible to the temptation of the ring. And then he leaves, and then Sam insists that he be allowed to stay with him. At first, he's like, no, I'm going to go off by myself. And so Sam ends up being the loyal hobbit who's going to take care of Frodo, and he's essential to Frodo's mission being successful in the end. But I think that the idea that nobody is immune to temptation, right, to sin, to evil, and I mean, going back to Hitler, a lot of people argue Hitler was just pure evil, right? One of the most evil humans that's ever lived. I don't believe that. I don't believe that Hitler was irredeemable. I mean, he made very bad decisions, and he was very, I think he was a very confused, very deceived individual. There's a lot of Nazi propaganda that was used during World War II that presented Hitler like a Christ figure. You got this horrible Treaty of Versailles that puts these horrible economic sanctions on Germany and made it almost impossible for them to survive. You've got the Great Depression. You've got their utter humiliating defeat in World War I. And so they were looking for somebody to restore to them this sense of superiority that they felt like they were entitled to. Hitler believed in, this idea of racial hierarchy and this idea, that the German people had the right to a certain status. He was confused, and he was, again, very sort of deceived by certain ideologies. And I think that's what played a role in him choosing to do the evil things that he did. And we see in Lord of the Rings that, again, Boromir and Saruman and Theoden, we have lots of characters that sometimes make really bad choices, and sometimes they recover from them and they're able to redeem themselves, and sometimes they don't, and they're completely sort of give themselves over to that darkness. But I agree with you, the hobbits do seem to be, why is Frodo chosen of all the people in Rivendell? Why is Frodo chosen to be the ring bearer? I think you're right that he seems, hobbits are not concerned with power. They're not concerned with things like money and reputation. They're very simple creatures that like good food and friendship and the beauty of nature. And they're very content to stay in their hobbit holes and read books and just sort of live a simple kind of life. As Christians, we want to surround ourselves with those kinds of people. Maybe there are a lot of people that seem religious outwardly that perhaps are using religion as a means of gain, of material and physical gain. It was no different during Jesus' time with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the priests that were trying to kill Jesus and then later killed Stephen and were trying to kill Peter and Paul. Even though they knew that they were of God, they knew they were doing miracles, that they were proving that their message was from God. They were literally fighting against God. I think they knew in their hearts they were fighting against God, but they were so obsessed with power and money and reputation that they had just lost their sense of right and wrong and had been so corrupted by it that they literally had given themselves over to Satan. Maybe that's Sauron, maybe that's Saruman, who've just totally given themselves over. What is it? It talks about when we give ourselves over to a reprobate mind. There's only one situation where we can't be forgiven, is when we refuse to repent. We fall into apostasy so utterly that we just have given ourselves over to darkness. We can be redeemed, but not until we change that heart issue that's led us to that horrible place.
Speaking of being wholly given over to darkness, let me insert here that the Citizen of Heaven podcast is officially anti-Hitler. We do oppose Hitler in every sense, so we'll just go ahead and stick that in there.
Absolutely. I was getting worried. Just in case
the social justice warriors are out there listening. Get that in there.
So, talking about the breaking of the fellowship, which is one of my favorite parts in the movies, there are lots of layers going on there. I appreciate Josh bringing up that initially Frodo is saying, I have to go it alone.
Right.
And Sam is the one that says, no, you can't go it alone. I'm coming with you no matter what. And so he doesn't go it alone, but it's certainly not Aragorn or even Gandalf that goes with them. It is this other weak halfling hobbit. But at the same time, while the fellowship has broken up, it's actually a whole lot more like Paul and Barnabas going separate ways. There's a recognition of roles. There's a recognition of goals. And Aragorn actually has a different role in this setup. It's really not for him to go into Mordor and destroy the ring. It's for him to be the king who returns. And so he and Legolas and Gimli need to go on that path. So the fellowship has broken up ostensibly, but in fact is still very much intact because they're all working towards the same goal, and nobody goes off alone. And that's fascinating. I do just have to say, and look, I can talk about this stuff all day long. You're going to have like a 5-hour episode of The Citizen of Heaven if we keep going. But Boromir is one of my all-time favorites. Right. It ends the Fellowship of the Ring, the movie, but it actually begins the Two Towers, the book, where he dies. But here is this fellow who struggles and struggles and struggles. But in the end, after he's had this serious fall of trying to steal the ring from Frodo, he has a realization. He comes to himself. And again, Lord of the Rings is not just an absolute parable to the gospel, because there is a sense in which Boromir redeems himself, but he gives himself back over in the service of deliverance, of being against evil, of being for good, and actually ends up sacrificing himself to protect the other two hobbits, Merry and Pippin. And so what a beautiful picture that is. I will admit that I think my favorite character in the books is Faramir, his brother, but I really love Boromir, and I love that scene. And I will admit that in the movie, at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king. It makes me want to cry right now thinking about it.
You needed all of those characters to do their part in order for the mission to be fulfilled. It reminds me of the church, right? And it talks about, all the parts of the body are important, and not everybody's meant to be a teacher. Not everybody's meant to be a preacher. Not everybody has the same talents and the same skills or the same roles. But collectively, the entire body all parts are necessary. And so, I think Tolkien definitely puts that idea into the book. That
you've been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.